The land was dry that year, so dry that the earth cracked open like old pottery and the wind carried dust instead of rain. Wheat fields withered, rivers shrank to trickles, and the once verdant valleys looked like the bones of something long dead. Hunger lingered in every home, pressing upon each table like an invisible guest that would not leave. In the village at the edge of the king's road, whispers ran through the people like a current. Whispers of fathers stealing bread from their sons, of mothers watering thin porridge with tears, of children fading like shadows as the famine gnawed away. No one was spared its cruelty, yet not all hearts bore the burden in the same way. There was one man, hard-eyed, lean, and bitter, who carried resentment like a cloak. He had taken another man's widow for a wife, and with her came a daughter not his own. At first he tolerated the girl, for she worked quietly and asked for little. But as hunger deepened and his own children cried at night for food, his gaze hardened upon her as though she were the cause of his misfortune. "Why should I feed another man's blood?" he muttered when he thought no one listened, "when my own children starve beside me?" The villagers saw his scowl, saw how the girl bent beneath his sharp words, but famine made cowards of them. No one spoke. They were too busy guarding their own crumbs of bread, too afraid to anger a neighbor in desperate times. It was in the heart of that famine that the rumor began, the rumor of a bargain struck for survival. A bag of grain, heavy and golden, carried on the back of a merchant's mule. To starving eyes it was not grain alone but salvation, a promise of life for weeks, maybe months. And in exchange the man gave away what was not his to give, the life of his stepdaughter. Some swore they saw it in the square, the merchant counting out the measure of wheat while the stepfather gripped the girl's arm. Others claimed they only heard the echoes after, like dust carried on the wind. But all agreed upon one thing: the trade was made. One life for one bag of grain. The villagers whispered in their houses at night. Some said it was monstrous. Some said it was clever. Others said famine stripped away the skin of civility, leaving only bone, and bone knew nothing of love. Yet even as they whispered, the girl's face lingered in their minds, the quiet grace in her eyes, the way she moved through hardship without complaint. They wondered what fate awaited her beyond the road, and whether the grain that replaced her soul would be worth the harvest of shame it sowed. And so the story began not with love or fortune, but with a bargain struck in hunger, a bargain that would ripple beyond fields and famine, reaching even the ear of a king. For while the grain filled empty bellies, the memory of the girl could not be buried so easily. She had been sold for bread, yet destiny would dress her in silk. The girl's name was Lala, though in the village she was more often called simply the widow's daughter. At 19 she carried the soft glow of youth, but her hands were roughened from work and her eyes carried the quiet patience of someone who had learned long ago that life would not give her ease. She was not tall nor striking, but there was a grace in her presence that drew notice, like a reed bending in the wind, never breaking no matter how strong the storm. Her days began before dawn, when the sky was still bruised with night. She rose to grind what little grain they had left, her thin arms steady on the stone, her body swaying with the rhythm of the mill. When that work was done she went to the animals, though there were fewer now than before the famine. She tended to the goats with gentle hands, whispering to them as though her voice alone might coax milk from their weary bodies. When her chores at home were complete, she carried her baskets into the village. She was skilled at weaving reeds into tight, sturdy containers, a craft her late mother had taught her. Even in famine, people needed baskets, for carrying firewood, for holding the few goods they still bartered. And so her weaving sustained her, if only barely. The villagers respected her diligence, though they did not go out of their way to help. She was quiet, never demanding, never complaining, and some mistook her gentleness for weakness. But those who looked more closely, an old woman at the well, a shepherd boy who watched her weave while his sheep grazed, saw the strength in her silence. They saw the way she endured her stepfather's scorn, the way she softened his household sharpness with her own calm. At night, when the house fell into quarrels and bitterness, she would slip away to the wildflowers that still grew at the edge of the barren fields. Somehow, even in drought, a few stubborn blossoms thrust their heads above the cracked soil. She tended them as though they were children, giving them drops of water from her own ration, humming soft songs her mother once sang. In those moments, when moonlight touched her face and the petals bent toward her, she looked less like a servant and more like something eternal, something belonging to the earth and sky. Her stepfather saw none of this. To him she was another mouth to feed, another reminder of the wife he had buried, another shadow in a house already pressed by hunger. Her half-brothers mocked her thin frame, tossing pebbles into her baskets and laughing at her patched dress. Her stepsisters sneered when she walked through the square, their eyes darting to see who noticed her. Yet Lala did not fight them. She did not answer cruelty with cruelty. Instead, she answered with kindness, mending the very garments her stepsisters tore, helping her brothers with their chores, offering the best of her weaving to the household before she took any coin for herself. Some whispered that such kindness was foolish. Others, though they did not say it aloud, admired her spirit. For in a time when hunger turned neighbor against neighbor, when men fought over scraps in the market, Lala remained unbroken in her gentleness. She carried her mother's memory in silence, carrying also the hope, fragile, secret, that perhaps one day her own life would not be bound to cruelty and want. But fate, like the famine, had other plans, and her strength would soon be tested in ways no one in the village could have imagined. The house where Lala lived was not a home, but a place where harsh words echoed louder than laughter. Its walls, once warmed by her mother's presence, now seemed to lean inward with bitterness. The hearth rarely burned, for firewood was scarce, but even when flames danced they gave no comfort. The warmth was devoured by scorn long before it reached her. Her stepfather was a man of hard lines, carved deeper by hunger and discontent. His eyes narrowed whenever they fell upon her, as though she were a thief who stole from his children's mouths. He never raised his hand against her, but his tongue was sharp, and each word struck harder than a blow. "You eat and give nothing in return," he spat one evening as she laid down the bread she had baked from her earnings. The bread was rough, barely enough to share among them, yet he tore it with his teeth as though it had cost him everything. Useless girl. A mouth that was never meant to be mine to feed. Lala lowered her eyes. She had brought the bread to the table willingly, yet the sting of his words clung like burrs. She whispered no reply, for she knew answering would only sharpen his anger. Her step-siblings followed his example as children often do. The older boys mocked her slender frame, flexing their arms and boasting of their strength while they jeered at her thinness. Sometimes they tossed pebbles into her weaving baskets, pretending to admire her skill only to ruin her careful work. Her stepsisters, draped in what scraps of fabric still passed for finery, treated her like a shadow. They laughed when she washed her worn dress in the stream, whispering that no water could wash poverty from her skin. They borrowed her woven baskets without thanks, leaving them broken in corners of the yard. When she went to mend them, they sneered, she was born to fix what others break. And still Lala endured. She swept the floors they dirted, cooked the meals they devoured, patched the clothes they tore. At times, even she wondered if kindness was foolishness, but whenever bitterness stirred in her chest, she thought of her mother's voice, soft and steady, "The world can harden, child. Do not let it harden you." So she smiled when she could, though her smiles were rare. She sang as she worked, quiet songs that barely rose above the clatter of her chores. In those songs, she poured the sorrow she could not speak, and sometimes, just sometimes, her step-siblings fell silent, caught by the sound before jealousy closed their ears again. The famine worsened. The house grew more desperate. Her stepfather grew crueler still. Each day, the measure of grain grew smaller. Each night, the sound of his muttering filled the dark. "Too many mouths," he grumbled. "Too much burden." If only, he did not finish, but the words hung heavy in the air. Lala heard them. She always heard them. She carried the weight of his resentment the way she carried water from the well, heavy, unavoidable, pressing upon her shoulders. And yet, she carried it without stumbling. The villagers noticed, though they said nothing. When she walked through the market, some pitied her, some turned away, and some envied the strength in her silence. But none interfered. Hunger had stolen their courage, leaving only whispers behind. In the evenings, after the cruelty of the day, she returned to her flowers at the edge of the fields. Even in drought, she found life clinging to the soil. She touched the blossoms gently, murmuring as though to old friends. Their bright faces lifted her own, and for a little while she remembered that beauty could grow even from dust. But her stepfather did not see beauty. He saw only a burden. And as the famine gnawed deeper into their lives, resentment ripened into resolve. Soon, his bitterness would lead him to the bargain that would change Lala's fate forever. The day of the bargain dawned with a sky the color of ash. The air hung heavy, without birdsong, without breeze, as if the world itself held its breath. Hunger gnawed not only at stomachs but at minds, and in the village square, people gathered to watch the merchants arrive. Their mules carried sacks of grain, barley, and millet, treasures worth more than silver in a land where fields had turned to dust. Lala's stepfather stood among them, his face drawn, his eyes sharp. His children clung to his sleeves, their lips cracked from thirst, their bellies hollow. But his gaze was not on them, nor on the grain itself. It was fixed on Lala, who stood a little apart, her woven basket clasped in her hands as though it could shield her from what she already sensed stirring in his heart. The merchant who approached was a man of broad shoulders and calculating eyes. His beard was oiled, his robe lined with dust from the road, and his voice carried the confidence of one who knew desperation made him powerful. He looked upon the villagers as a wolf looks upon sheep, measuring their fear, weighing their hunger. When he came to Lala's stepfather, he offered no greeting, only a question: "What will you give for a bag of grain?" Her stepfather's mouth twisted. He had nothing of value, no jewelry, no livestock, no coin. His farm was barren, his tools rusted with disuse. But he had one possession that was not truly his: a daughter, quiet and unclaimed, bound to his household by circumstance and not by blood. Lala felt his eyes upon her then, and though he said nothing yet, her heart clenched. She held the basket tighter, her breath shallow, as though some unseen thread tugged her toward the fate waiting just ahead. The merchant followed the stepfather's gaze and let out a low hum. His lips curled, half smile, half snare. "That one," he said softly, as if it were an afterthought. "The girl. She is strong enough to work. She could earn her bread in service. For her, I will give you 1 bag of grain." A silence rippled through the square. Some villagers lowered their eyes, others shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Hunger makes cowards, and hunger sat on every shoulder. Lala's stepfather hesitated only long enough to glance at the sack of grain on the mule's back. Its weight promised life. It promised his children's survival, his own survival. His heart, already hardened by bitterness, did not waver long. "She is not mine by blood," he said, his voice flat. "Take her." The words fell like stones. Lala's breath caught in her chest, but no sound escaped her lips. The merchant snapped his fingers and one of his men stepped forward, untying the grain from the mule's back and dropping it heavily into her stepfather's arms. The thud of the sack seemed louder than the girl's silence, louder than the whispers that began among the villagers. The bargain was sealed. The stepfather did not look at her. He did not speak her name. He turned away with the sack of grain, clutching it as though it were gold, while his children cheered at the promise of full bellies. Lala stood still, her basket trembling in her hands. Then, with a firm grip, the merchant's servant took her arm. She stumbled but did not cry out. The villagers parted, opening a path through the square. Some turned their backs. Others watched with sorrow they dared not voice. A few muttered prayers, but softly, so softly as though afraid the famine might hear. And so, sold for a measure of survival, Lala was led away. Behind her, the sound of the merchant's mules faded into the dust, and with it, the last shred of belonging she had known. Ahead of her lay only the unknown, and a silence deeper than any she had endured before. The road stretched wide and endless, a ribbon of dust and stone winding away from everything Lala had ever known. She walked barefoot, her basket clutched to her chest, though it carried nothing now. A servant of the merchant tugged at her arm whenever she slowed, and the mules clattered ahead, their hooves raising small clouds that stung her eyes. Behind her, the village was shrinking, swallowed by distance and shimmering heat. She did not turn back, not because she lacked the desire, but because her stepfather had already turned his back on her. What remained there for her to see? A man clutching grain as though it were treasure, a family that had eaten her hope before the famine had eaten their crops. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, falling into the dust. They left no mark, no darkened trail, for the earth was too thirsty to hold grief. The merchant rode on a mule, glancing back at her now and then with the sharp eyes of one who weighed goods, not people. To him, she was not a daughter betrayed, not a young woman torn from home. She was simply a bargain made, a body with strength enough to serve. His men spoke in low voices, sometimes laughing, their words slipping past her like thorns across skin. The sun climbed high, burning her shoulders. Sweat mingled with her tears and her feet ached from the stones. Still she walked, her breath shallow but steady, because to stumble was to be dragged, and she had learned long ago that silence and endurance were armor. As they crossed a barren field, she looked at the sky. A single hawk circled overhead, its wings wide, its cry piercing. She whispered under her breath, her lips moving in prayer, "O Mother, wherever you are, see me. If I am lost, let me not be forgotten. If I am sold, let me not be broken." The wind carried no answer. Only the creak of mule harnesses and the crunch of boots on gravel filled the air. When night fell, they camped by a dried-out stream bed. The merchant's men built a small fire, tossing in twigs that barely caught. The light flickered on their faces, making their shadows long and crooked. They ate bread and dates, speaking of trade routes and profits. None offered her food. She sat apart, hugging her knees, her stomach a hollow drum that echoed with each pang. One of the younger men threw her a crust at last, more mockery than kindness. "Here, girl. Don't die before we reach the city. The master paid grain for you." Lala caught it in her basket, her fingers trembling. She broke the bread slowly, whispering thanks as though it were a feast, and ate each crumb with reverence. Her hunger softened, but her heart remained raw. That night, lying on the hard earth, she could not close her eyes. She stared at the stars, countless and cold, scattered like seeds across the black sky. She remembered how her mother once told her that the stars were souls watching, and for a moment she dared to imagine that someone was watching her now, that her suffering was not unseen, that her steps would not vanish into dust. The road the next day was harsher. Hills rose and her legs burned with each climb. Blisters swelled on her feet until every step was fire. The men mocked her pace, tugging her forward when she faltered. The merchant ignored her pain, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the spires of a distant city shimmered faintly in the heat. Still she walked. She thought of the wildflowers she had once tended, their petals delicate yet strong enough to push through stone. She whispered their names like prayers: poppy, anemone, rose. With each name, she took another step, as though the memory of blossoms could carry her when her body could not. On the third night, the road cut through a forest. Shadows clung to the trees, and the firelight was swallowed quickly by the dark. The men slept heavily, lulled by wine, but Lala lay awake again. The basket sat by her side, empty, yet she cradled it like a child. She pressed her forehead against it and whispered, "I will not end as grain. I will not end as ash. Let there be more for me." A breeze stirred then, carrying the scent of unseen flowers, faint but real. Her heart ached with sudden, inexplicable hope. She closed her eyes, letting the wind brush her cheeks as though it were a mother's hand. By dawn, her eyes were rimmed with red, but her spirit, though bruised, was not broken. The road stretched ahead, promising nothing but uncertainty. Yet something had shifted within her. She would walk it still, and though she had been sold for a bag of grain, her worth was not measured in hunger or coin. Somewhere beyond the dust, beyond the cruelty of men, destiny was waiting. And she would endure long enough to meet it. The city rose from the dust like a mirage of stone and smoke. Lala had never seen such high walls, such gates carved with beasts and kings, nor heard such clamor of voices and wheels. She clutched her empty basket tightly as they entered, shrinking against the press of people who did not notice her, one more shadow in a world that measured lives in coin. The merchant's house stood near the marketplace, a sprawling structure of sun-baked brick, its doors wide, its windows latticed. To her eyes, it looked like a palace, but she soon learned that its beauty was only surface. From the moment she was led inside, her place was made clear. She was not a guest, not kin, not even fully human in their eyes. She was a possession. "Work, girl," the steward ordered, thrusting a broom into her hands before the dust of the road had left her hair. "Sweep the floors. Then fetch water. Then grind the grain." The irony did not escape her. Sold for a sack of grain, and now she must grind it for others to feast upon. Days bled into one another. She rose before the sun to carry heavy jars from the well, her shoulders aching, her feet raw. She swept and scrubbed until her fingers blistered. She was given no bed, only a mat near the storeroom, where the smell of spices clung to her skin. Her meals were meager scraps, always last, always cold. The merchant's wife barely glanced at her, except to scold. The other servants mocked her quiet nature, calling her grain girl, laughing that she had been bought cheap. Yet Lala did not answer back. She lowered her gaze and worked as she always had, but within her silence, something began to stir, not submission but a patience deeper than cruelty. At night, when the house slept, she sat by the small lattice window, gazing at the courtyard where vines crept along the walls. She whispered to the plants as she had once whispered to wildflowers back home. "Grow," she urged softly. "Even here grow." The vines seemed to listen. Their tendrils stretched farther each morning, their leaves catching the faintest moonlight. When she touched them, she felt warmth, as though the earth itself remembered her. One evening, as she carried grain to the storeroom, she caught sight of herself in a polished brass tray. Dust streaked her cheeks, her dress was torn, her hair unkempt. Yet in her eyes she saw a glimmer, not brokenness but endurance. A thought came to her then, unbidden and strange. Silk begins as thread, unseen, unwanted, yet it weaves into something no one can ignore. That night, she dreamt of herself walking in garments that shimmered like water, her head lifted high, the mockery of her stepfather and these strangers falling away like husks. When she awoke, she held the dream like a secret ember inside her chest. Still the labor continued, harsh and endless. The merchant's voice thundered when work was slow. The wife sneered at her rags. The other servants pushed her aside at the well. Yet when she swept the courtyard, she hummed softly under her breath, and the sound comforted her, as though she carried a hidden music no one else could hear. The house grew fat with trade. Silk and spice came through its doors, jewels glinted in its chambers. And in the midst of this wealth, the girl sold for grain moved silently, a shadow among treasures, unseen yet gathering strength. For though she bent her back to labor, her spirit was straightening, quietly, invisibly, like the stalk of a plant that waits for the season when it will bloom. The seasons turned, and with them came the festival of the new moon, a time when merchants paraded their wealth through the city streets, draping stalls in silks, hanging lanterns from doorways, burning incense until the air itself seemed gilded. 4 days the city prepared, sweeping its alleys, stringing banners across the marketplace. In the merchant's house, the bustle was relentless. Carpets were beaten, vessels polished, tables set with spices and wine. Lala worked until her arms trembled, scrubbing floors that would soon be trampled again, polishing brass trays until her own reflection blurred from exhaustion. "Faster, girl," the steward barked. "The merchant will host noble guests. If they see a single speck of dust, you'll feel his wrath." She lowered her gaze and obeyed, but her heart beat with unease. The house glittered with wealth, yet her own corner of it remained bare, her mat frayed, her dress torn. She was invisible among their grandeur, until the night of the festival changed everything. That evening, lanterns blazed across the marketplace like stars fallen to earth. Music spilled from every doorway, drums and flutes weaving into a jubilant chorus. Nobles and common folk alike mingled, eating bread fragrant with sesame, sipping wine sweetened with honey. The merchant's guests arrived in fine carriages, their robes embroidered with gold thread. Lala, as always, was kept behind the scenes. She carried platters, poured wine, and slipped silently away before anyone could notice her. Yet in her passing she caught fragments of laughter, glimpses of silks shimmering like rivers. She thought of her dream, herself walking among such garments, and a strange ache filled her chest. Later, when her duties were momentarily done, she lingered in the courtyard where the vines crept along the walls. The moon hung full and white above, its light spilling over the leaves like silver. She touched the vines and whispered, "One day let me grow too. Let me be seen." As if in answer, a breeze stirred, carrying with it the sound of flutes from the street. Drawn by the music, she edged closer to the lattice gate that opened onto the marketplace. From there she saw the festival in its fullness. Dancers whirling in silken skirts, children chasing lanterns that floated on strings, vendors tossing sweets wrapped in paper. And then her eyes fell on a procession winding through the crowd. At its head rode a young nobleman, perhaps a prince, perhaps a governor's son, though she could not tell. His cloak shimmered with silks, his bearing proud yet strangely thoughtful. The people parted before him, cheering, bowing. For a fleeting moment, his gaze lifted toward the merchant's house. And through the lattice their eyes met. It was the briefest glance, a flicker in the lantern light, but in that instant Lala felt the dream within her stir like a bird breaking its shell. She dropped her gaze at once, heart pounding, ashamed of her rags, her bare feet, the dust clinging to her. Yet she could not shake the certainty that she had been seen, not as a servant, not as property, but as someone who existed. The moment passed. The nobleman rode on. Music swelled again, drowning her thoughts. But the ember inside her glowed brighter now, refusing to fade. When she returned to her mat that night, she lay awake, staring at the dark rafters. Around her, the house slept, bloated with wealth, unseeing of her. Yet within her, something had shifted. The grain her stepfather sold her for was gone, eaten, forgotten. But she remained, and more than that, she carried within her a resilience that no trade could measure. The world thought her worth less than a sack of grain, yet the vines whispered otherwise. The dream of silk was not foolish, it was waiting. And though she could not yet know how or when, the turning of fortune had begun. In the days that followed the festival, the house returned to its old rhythm of orders barked, footsteps hurried and silence enforced. Yet for Lala something within had changed. She carried her chores with the same diligence, but no longer as if her spirit were shackled to each command. There was a lightness in her movements, a secret pulse that hummed with possibility. Sometimes, when she remembered the nobleman's eyes catching hers, she felt a warmth rise in her chest. Not because she believed he would rescue her, such dreams were for foolish tales, but because that moment had shown her what she had forgotten. She was not invisible. Even through rags and dust she had been seen. One morning while sweeping the courtyard she discovered something strange. The vines she had so often whispered to had twined themselves together in an intricate knot. When she bent closer she gasped. The leaves had wrapped around fine threads, thin as spider silk, but shimmering faintly in the light. She touched one and it clung to her fingertip, soft yet strong. That night after her duties she returned to the vines. Again she found threads, more of them, catching the moonlight like strands of woven water. They seemed to appear only in the quiet hours when no one else was near. She plucked a strand and held it up. It gleamed as though it carried the light of the stars themselves. Her heart raced. Was this the answer to her whispers, her prayers? Hiding the thread within her sleeve, she began to collect more carefully night after night. Soon she had enough to attempt something small. With fingers that had learned patience from grinding grain and mending rags, she twisted the threads together, weaving them into a narrow band. It shimmered like no cloth she had ever seen. She wore it under her dress where no one could see, a secret token against despair. Every time the merchant's wife scolded her or the servants mocked her, she pressed her hand to the band and remembered the vines, the moonlight, the threads that belonged to no one but her. But the threads did not stop there. Each night they multiplied until she had enough to try weaving something larger. She borrowed an old spindle, abandoned in the corner of the storeroom, and began to spin. The silk wound tighter, smoother, until it gleamed in the lantern light like liquid dawn. At first her work was clumsy, but her hands learned quickly. It was as though the skill had been planted in her long ago, waiting for the right season to bloom. Soon she fashioned a length of cloth, no wider than her arm but long enough to drape across her shoulders. When she tried it on, she hardly recognized herself in the polished tray. The ragged girl of dust and grain seemed cloaked in a shimmer of dignity. She dared not wear it openly. By day she remained the servant girl, sweeping, fetching, grinding. By night she was a weaver of moonlight. One evening while she worked she imagined what she might create if she had enough thread. A gown that flowed like water, soft as the breeze, radiant as the dawn. She could walk among the nobles not as a servant, but as herself, transformed. The thought frightened her almost as much as it thrilled her. Could she ever stand so tall? Could the girl sold for a bag of grain truly return dressed in silk? The vines, as though answering, rustled softly in the night air. Her secret remained hidden, though danger loomed closer than she realized. For the merchant's wife, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, had begun to notice her slipping away at night, her tired hands concealing something. Envy stirred in her heart, not because she suspected magic, but because she sensed the girl's spirit had found a place of refuge she could not control. But Lala was careful. She folded the silk away buried beneath her mat. She wore only rags by day, endured scorn, and kept her dream close like a flame hidden in the hollow of her hands. The threads continued to grow, and with them her quiet confidence. Something was being woven not just of silk but of destiny. The world had thought her worth no more than grain. But soon the city would see her as she truly was. And though she could not know when the moment would come, she felt it approaching as surely as the dawn follows the longest night. The house had grown restless. Trade was good, yet the merchant's wife found reasons to complain more than ever. The other servants whispered behind their hands, watching Lala with narrowed eyes. Something about her quiet glow unsettled them. They did not know of the silk hidden beneath her mat, nor of the nights she spent weaving by moonlight. Yet people often sense what they cannot name, and envy is quick to find its excuse. One morning, while Lala was fetching water, the merchant's wife crept into the storeroom where she slept. The mat looked no different from any other, worn, threadbare, but a faint shimmer caught her eye where the corner was folded. She pulled it aside. Her breath caught. There, neatly folded, lay a strip of cloth finer than anything she had ever touched, finer even than what her husband bought from distant caravans. It gleamed as though woven from starlight, soft yet radiant, every thread alive with secret fire. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. How could a servant girl, one bought for grain, possess such treasure? When Lala returned with the water, she froze. The merchant's wife stood waiting, silk draped across her arms like captured sunlight. "Where did you steal this?" she hissed. I did not steal," Lala whispered, her heart pounding. "I wove it." The wife's eyes narrowed to slits. "Do not lie to me. No loom in this house could make such cloth. Speak the truth, girl, or I will have you whipped." Lala bowed her head, silent. How could she explain the vines, the moonlight, the miracle that answered only her prayers? To speak of it would be to invite greater cruelty. The wife's voice hardened. "This will belong to the merchant now. Perhaps he can sell it for a fortune. As for you, be grateful I do not accuse you before the guards." She swept away, clutching the silk as if it were her own prize. Lala sank to her knees, trembling. Her secret was broken. The cloth she had woven in hope, the symbol of her dream, had been torn from her hands. Yet even as despair pressed in, a whisper stirred within her. The thread is not finished. What is taken can return. What is hidden will be revealed. That night she crept again to the vines. To her astonishment, the threads were waiting, more plentiful than before, as though the earth itself pitied her loss. She gathered them in her hands, weaving swiftly, her tears mingling with the moonlight. By dawn, another length of silk lay across her lap, shimmering brighter than the first. She folded it close, swearing she would not let it be stolen again. But the merchant's wife, clutching the first cloth, was already whispering to her husband, "See what the girl hides. If one strip fetches gold, imagine what more could bring. We must not let her keep such things for herself." Greed kindled in the merchant's eyes, and far away beyond their plotting, fate quickened its pace. For soon the silk would not be hidden in shadows, nor clutched by greedy hands. It would walk into the light, and the city would see the girl not as grain, not as servant, but as something far greater. The merchant had never held cloth so fine. He turned the shimmering length over and over in his hands, watching how the light slid across it like water under the sun. Even his silks from the eastern caravans looked dull beside it. "This," he muttered, "will fetch more than gold. This is fit for kings." His wife smiled thinly. "And kings pay well. Shall we present it at the next court gathering? Let His Majesty see that your house produces wonders." The merchant agreed at once, though he cast a suspicious glance toward the girl who stood silently by the doorway. Lala lowered her eyes, her heart a storm within her chest. She had no voice in this matter. What she had woven in secret under the moon now belonged to the merchant, or so he claimed. But deep inside she knew, the cloth did not belong to him. It belonged to the one whose tears and prayers had spun it into being. Word of the fabric spread quickly. Nobles who visited the merchant's house gasped at its luster, whispering that such a cloth had never been seen before. Soon the king himself heard rumors of a silk that glowed as if woven from the heavens. He sent word. The merchant was to bring this miracle to the palace. On the appointed day, the merchant dressed in his richest robes, his wife trailing proudly behind. They carried the shimmering fabric on a velvet cushion, wrapped in careful folds. Lala was made to walk behind them, silent as a shadow, carrying the weight of baskets though her heart carried far more. The palace dazzled her eyes, golden doors, marble floors, courtyards with fountains that sang. She felt small, yet the silk within her heart whispered, "You belong here too." In the grand hall, nobles gathered as the merchant approached the throne. The king, tall and grave, with eyes like steady flame, regarded the cloth as it was unfurled before him. Gasps rippled through the hall as the silk shimmered, alive with colors that shifted like dawn and dusk. The king rose from his seat, stepping down from the dais. He touched the fabric with his hand, and his gaze sharpened. "This," he said softly, "is no ordinary cloth. Tell me, merchant, from where does it come?" The merchant bowed low. "From my house, your majesty. It is the work of my household." But the king did not look at him. His eyes moved past the merchant, past the wife, until they rested on the girl in rags standing silently behind them. Lala felt her breath catch. His gaze was steady, searching, as though he saw the hidden threads in her very soul. He beckoned her forward. "You," he said. "Did your hands make this?" The hall fell silent. The merchant's wife stiffened. The merchant began to protest, but the king lifted a hand and all words ceased. Lala bowed low, trembling. "Yes, my lord," she whispered. It was woven, in silence, under the moon. The king studied her, then the cloth again. "A treasure such as this cannot be born from greed. It bears the mark of sorrow, of patience, of hope. No servant could spin such threads unless truth itself had guided her hands." Whispers filled the hall. The nobles leaned forward, eyes wide. The merchant stammered. "She is nothing, majesty. A girl bought for grain, no more. The cloth is ours." But the king silenced him with a single glance. The silk shimmered between them all, alive with the girl's hidden strength. And in that moment the first veil of lies began to tear, thread by thread, before the eyes of the kingdom. The hall remained hushed, the air thick with the weight of the king's question. His eyes did not leave Lala, though she stood trembling in her ragged dress, her bare feet pressed against the polished floor. Around her, nobles shifted uneasily, and used to silence so sharp. "Speak," the the king said gently, but his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. Tell me how you came to weave such wonder. Lala's lips trembled. She had spent her life bowed under cruelty, her voice silenced, her spirit beaten down. Yet here, under the gaze of the king, something in her lifted. She clasped her hands together, steadying herself. My lord, she began, her voice soft but clear, I was not born to this house. I was sold into it. Gasps swept through the nobles. The merchant paled. My stepfather, she continued, sold me to this merchant for a sack of grain. My mother was long gone, and I had no one to shield me. In this house I was made to serve, to labor without rest, to wear rags while wealth surrounded me. Yet I did not despair. I whispered to the vines in the courtyard, and under the moon, threads of silk came forth. I wove them in secret, weaving my prayers and tears into every strand. The king's gaze did not waver. And when the cloth was complete? The merchant's wife stole it, Lala said quietly. She claimed it for her own. I was told it would be sold, and that I was nothing but a servant with no right to it. But the truth is this, she raised her eyes at last, her voice steady. The silk belongs not to them but to the sorrow that birthed it. It is my story, my pain, my endurance. The court erupted into whispers. The merchant surged forward, sweat beading his brow. Lies, Majesty. She is but a servant girl. She speaks falsehoods to steal what is mine. Her stepfather himself can be summoned to confirm. Then summon him, the king said coldly. The order rippled outward. Messengers rode swiftly, and within days the stepfather was dragged into the palace hall. His clothes were worn, his eyes mean, his back bent from years of bitterness. When he saw Lala standing before the throne, his lip curled. You, he spat. Still ungrateful even now. The king's voice cut like steel. Is it true you sold this girl for grain? The man sneered. What else was she worth? She ate my bread, brought no dowry, and filled my house with sorrow. A sack of grain was more useful than her. A shocked murmur surged through the nobles. The king's expression hardened, and for a moment the hall seemed to darken with his wrath. You speak of a daughter as though she were cattle, he said. You sold her life for hunger's sake, and now you dare stand without shame? The stepfather faltered, but pride twisted his face. She was weak, a burden. Let the merchant use her hands. What more is there to tell? But others began to speak. A servant from the merchant's house stepped forward, trembling. It is true, Majesty. She worked without rest, given scraps while the household feasted. We mocked her, yet she never answered with cruelty. She whispered to the vines, and the silk came as if the earth itself pitied her. None else could have woven it. Another voice rose, an old neighbor from her village who had come with the stepfather. I knew her mother. Gentle folk both. The girl was kind, always tending to others. When her mother died, the stepfather turned against her, saying she carried only misfortune. He shamed us all when he sold her. The truth spilled like floodwaters. Each voice added weight to her story, until even the nobles who had doubted looked at Lala with awe. The king lifted his hand and silence fell once more. He looked at Lala, then at the merchant, then at the stepfather. This girl, he declared, is no servant, no chattel, no burden. She is a daughter of this kingdom. Her suffering has been turned into beauty, her endurance into treasure. The silk she wove belongs not to greedy hands but to her alone. The merchant's face drained of color. His wife shrank behind him, her envy curdling into fear. The stepfather glared, but no words came. The king's gaze burned into them all. You have clothed yourselves in lies and cruelty, but truth cannot be bound. It blooms even in ashes, even in sorrow, even in silence. This court will not forget. Lala bowed her head, her heart thundering. For the first time in her life, her voice had not been ignored. For the first time her story had been heard. And though the night of her transformation had only begun, she knew she would never again be unseen. The hall stood heavy with silence after Lala's truth had been unveiled. No one dared breathe too loudly, for the weight of the king's wrath lingered in the air like a storm gathering. The king rose slowly from his throne. His robe, stitched with golden threads, fell in measured folds that whispered against the marble floor. When he spoke, his voice was like thunder wrapped in calm. Bring them forward. The guards seized the stepfather, the merchant, and his wife, dragging them to kneel at the foot of the dais. Their protests rang out, but they were hollow, breaking against the walls of truth that had already been spoken. You, the king said to the stepfather, his gaze cutting like a blade, sold your own daughter for grain. You treated her life as less than an animal's, and with your hands, you turned cruelty into trade. The stepfather's face twisted with rage. She was nothing. A curse upon my house. Silence, the king thundered, and the man fell quiet, trembling. You sought to erase her, but she has returned clothed in silk, her spirit brighter than any jewel. From this day, you shall carry the mark of your shame. He gestured, and a branding iron was brought forth, glowing red from the brazier. The guards held the stepfather as he thrashed, but the iron was pressed to his arm. The scent of scorched flesh filled the air. He screamed, the sound echoing across the hall. The mark seared into his skin was a sheaf of wheat, symbol of what he had traded her for. You will walk the villages as a beggar, the king declared, and wherever men see the mark they will know you for what you are, a man who sold blood for bread. The stepfather collapsed, weeping, his pride shattered. Then the king turned to the merchant and his wife. And you, greedy hands that sought to steal beauty born of sorrow. You clothed yourselves in her labor, parading her wonder as your own. You will return every coin you gained from her work. Your house will be stripped of silks and jewels, until only coarse wool remains. The merchant's wife wailed. Majesty, have mercy. We only sought honor. You sought honor at the cost of another's suffering, the king replied coldly. You will live in humility until you understand that honor cannot be stolen, it is earned. The guards dragged them away. The hall shivered with whispers, but no one dared speak against the judgment. At last the king turned to Lala. His expression softened, the steel in his voice melting into something warmer. And you, he said, who have endured cruelty, who turned pain into beauty, your story will not be forgotten. From this day forth you are under my protection. No hand shall raise itself against you again. Lala bowed, her tears falling freely now, but they were not tears of sorrow. For the first time they were tears of release, of relief, of hope. The king raised his hand, and a servant stepped forward carrying a folded garment. It shimmered faintly under the torchlight, a robe of silk woven not of gold or jewels, but of threads so fine and soft they seemed like captured moonlight. Wear this, the king said, not as a token of wealth, but as a sign that your dignity is restored. You are no longer unseen, no longer silenced. You are Lala, the one who returned clothed in silk. As the robe was draped across her shoulders, the hall filled with light, as though the sun itself had risen within the walls. Nobles bowed their heads. Even those who had mocked her in the village whispered her name with reverence. And so, judgment was passed, not only against cruelty but in favor of renewal. A story once hidden in shadow had stepped into the light, and the kingdom would never again forget. Seasons turned, and the tale of Lala spread far beyond the village where her suffering had begun. Minstrels carried her story on their tongues, weaving it into songs sung in marketplaces and courts. Mothers whispered it to their children at night, telling them of the girl who was traded for a bag of grain yet returned draped in silk. The king, wishing never again to see such cruelty hidden in silence, declared a new tradition, the Festival of Silk. Each year, on the night of the harvest moon, villages and cities across the realm would gather by their rivers, fields, and marketplaces to honor the resilience of those who had been wronged but rose again. On the eve of the first festival, banners of soft silk, woven in hues of white, crimson, and gold, were strung from door to door. Even the poorest cottages hung scraps of cloth, dyed with herbs or flower petals, fluttering like butterflies in the breeze. Every home contributed, for the king's decree had been clear. This was not a celebration of wealth, but of dignity reborn. In the village where Lala had once been scorned, the people assembled with mingled shame and hope. The memory of their silence during her suffering still weighed heavily on them, yet they longed to atone. Women spun garlands from wheat stalks, remembering how she had once been sold for grain. Men carried water jars polished until they gleamed, recalling the cruel trade that had bound her fate. Children ran barefoot through the dust, their laughter ringing like bells, their small hands trailing strips of silk tied to sticks that fluttered as they danced. At the heart of the square stood Lala herself, no longer the ragged girl mocked in shadows, but a woman whose quiet grace now commanded reverence. She wore the robe of moonlight silk gifted by the king, but she also bore around her waist a sash she had woven with her own hands from simple threads. It was her way of reminding all that beauty could be born even from the humblest fibers. When the festival drums began, silence fell across the crowd. Torches flared. The eldest villagers stepped forward, holding bowls of grain mixed with ashes, their hands trembling. With solemnity they scattered the mixture into the soil at the edge of the fields. The act was both remembrance and renewal, a tribute to the girl whose ashes had once seemed destined for nothingness, yet whose spirit had returned brighter than silk. Then, as the drums quickened, Women brought forth long strips of fabric dyed in colors that mirrored the sunset. They stretched them across the square, weaving them overhead until the sky seemed netted in silk. Beneath this canopy the people sang, not songs of sorrow but songs of triumph. Their voices rose together, weaving through the air like threads on a loom. Lala stood in the center, her hands clasped before her. She listened not as a figure of pity but as one of strength. Children approached her, offering roses they had plucked from gardens and wild hillsides. She bent to accept them, her smile as radiant as dawn. The fragrance of blossoms mingled with the scent of roasted bread and honey, filling the night with sweetness. When the king himself arrived with his court, the villagers bowed low, but he raised his hands. "No one bows tonight," he declared. "Tonight we stand as one, united not by wealth or rank, but by the truth that cruelty cannot destroy what is pure." He turned to Lala. "You have given this kingdom a gift no treasury could hold, the lesson that dignity cannot be sold, only hidden for a time until it blooms anew. From this day your name is written into our history." The crowd erupted into cheers, some shouting her name, others weeping openly. For the first time, joy and justice stood hand in hand, and the night no longer belonged to shadows. As the festival neared its height, lanterns wrapped in silk were lit and carried to the river. Families lowered them into the water, watching as hundreds of glowing orbs floated downstream. Their light rippled across the current, as though the river itself had dressed in silk. The villagers whispered that Lala's spirit walked upon those waters, her steps trailing silver sparks. Above, the moon glowed full and serene, casting its light across the square, the river and the fields. It seemed to bless the gathering, as if heaven itself honored the girl who had risen from ashes of betrayal into the radiance of truth. That night, laughter replaced silence, and song replaced whispers of cruelty. In every woven thread, in every lantern flame, in every step of the dance, the people remembered. And so the Festival of Silk was born, not only as a tribute to Lala but as a promise that no one in the kingdom would ever again be sold for grain, silenced by cruelty, or stripped of their dignity. Generations would come and go, but each year when the harvest moon rose, silk banners would flutter, lanterns would glow and voices would sing. And in every song, every child's laughter, and every flicker of light on the river's surface, the memory of Lala, the girl who returned dressed in silk, would live forever. Years turned into decades and decades into centuries. The kingdom grew, villages became towns, kings came and went, yet the festival of silk remained. Each harvest moon, silk banners still rippled across streets, lanterns still floated down rivers, and children still sang the story of the girl who returned in robes brighter than dawn. Old women told it by the fire, their wrinkled hands mimicking the weaving of threads as they spoke. Once, they whispered, there was a girl sold for a bag of grain. They thought they had erased her. But the river carried her spirit back, and the kingdom learned that silk can rise from sorrow. Wide-eyed children leaned closer, clutching scraps of colored cloth as though they were treasures. Travelers passing through the land carried the story onward. Merchants spoke of it in distant markets. Minstrels sang it across mountain passes, their voices echoing in valleys where Lala's name had never been heard before. In time, the tale was no longer just of one girl, but of countless souls who had suffered, endured, and risen again. Lala became the symbol of all who had been silenced, forgotten, or betrayed, yet found their dignity reborn. In her own village, where cruelty had once flourished, the story held its deepest weight. The stepfather's descendants bore his shame, never forgetting the mark of wheat branded upon him. But rather than hiding, they chose to honor Lala, joining the festival each year with humility. They hung the longest silks, lit the brightest lanterns, and spoke her name with reverence. Redemption, too, had become part of her legacy. On certain nights, when the harvest moon was full and the river shone like silver, villagers swore they saw her. A woman cloaked in silk walked along the water's edge, her robe trailing behind her like a ribbon of starlight. She never spoke, yet her presence was enough, the assurance that she was not gone, but woven into the very fabric of the land. Children grew into adults, adults into elders, but the lesson remained the same: dignity cannot be sold. No cruelty, no betrayal, no fire or river could erase it. It lived as eternal as silk threads spun under moonlight. And so the tale closed where it had begun, not with sorrow but with wonder. For in every strip of cloth tied to a doorway, in every lantern floating downstream, in every whispered story told to a child, Lala's spirit lived on. The kingdom never forgot. The river never forgot. And the silks that bloomed each year against the night sky were more than fabric. They were memory, justice, and hope. The girl once sold for a bag of grain had become eternal.